You are not the only human species that ever walked this planet. For most of history, that sentence would have sounded impossible. But 40,000 years ago, it was simply true. Your ancestors shared the earth with another kind of human, taller in the chest, heavier in the brow, stronger in almost every measurable way than the thin-boned newcomers who had just arrived from Africa. And then, they were gone. Not slowly faded, not gradually replaced. Gone. The question of why has haunted scientists for over a century, and the closer they look, the stranger the answer becomes. Picture Europe 60,000 years ago. Ice covers the north. Forests and grasslands stretch across the rest. And moving through that landscape are groups of Neanderthals, following herds of mammoth and bison, building fires in cave mouths, wrapping themselves in hides against the cold. They were not the lumbering brutes of old textbooks. They buried their dead. Some evidence suggests they placed flowers in graves. They made tools specialized enough to butcher an animal in minutes. Their brains, on average, were slightly larger than yours. For over 300,000 years, this worked. Neanderthals were not failing. They were thriving in one of the harshest climates humans have ever adapted to. Then, something changed. Around 50,000 years ago, a different kind of human began moving north out of Africa. Smaller frames, longer legs built for endurance rather than power, and a set of behaviors that, on the surface, looked unremarkable. But unremarkable is not what the evidence shows. Somewhere in the overlap between these two species, something happened that would leave a signature inside your own cells. In 2010, a team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo sequenced the first Neanderthal genome. What they found rewrote the story completely. Neanderthals had not simply vanished. Part of them was still here. If your ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your genome is Neanderthal. Not metaphorically, literally. Genes that shape how your skin responds to sunlight, how your immune system reacts to certain viruses, even genes linked to sleep patterns, may have come directly from them. So the first assumption falls apart immediately. This was never a clean story of one species replacing another. For thousands of years, in caves and river valleys across Europe and the Middle East, two human species met. And at least some of the time, they had children together. Which raises the real question. If they interbred, if they were adaptable, if they had survived ice ages your species never had to face, why did only one side of that family tree survive to write this sentence? The old answer was simple. Homo sapiens were smarter, better tool users, superior hunters who simply outcompeted a dying species into extinction. But the archaeological record does not support a story that clean. Neanderthal tools, particularly the later Châtelperronian tool sets found in France, show symbolic behavior. Pierced shells, pigment use, ornamental objects. Whether they invented this independently or learned it from contact with incoming humans is still debated among researchers like João Zilhão. But either way, the picture of an intellectually stagnant species does not hold up. So if intelligence alone does not explain it, something else has to. Look closer at the numbers, and a different picture starts to form. Genetic studies estimate that the total Neanderthal population across their entire range in Europe and Asia may have never exceeded around 70,000 individuals at any point. Spread across an entire continent, that is not a thriving population. That is a scattered one. Imagine the population of a small town, distributed across an area larger than the modern United States. Isolated pockets, separated by mountains and forests, rarely encountering each other. Some Neanderthal genomes show signs of inbreeding severe enough to suggest small, fragmented groups struggling to maintain genetic diversity. A population that thin does not need to be defeated. It only needs to be unlucky. And then the climate turned against them. Between 59,000 and 24,000 years ago, Earth cycled through a series of extreme climate swings, a period scientists call Heinrich events. Temperatures dropped sharply. Landscapes that had supported large grazing animals collapsed into tundra. For a species whose survival depended almost entirely on hunting large game at close range, the disappearance of that game was not an inconvenience. It was catastrophic. Now, place a second human species into that same shrinking landscape. One with slightly more flexible diets, evidence of fishing, small game hunting, and plant processing that gave it more ways to survive when the megafauna disappeared. One with, based on some genetic estimates, faster population growth and wider social networks across greater distances. Neither species needed to fight the other for this to end in only one outcome. This is the twist that changes how the entire story should be understood. Extinction did not require a war. It did not require superior weapons or violent conquest, although isolated instances of conflict likely occurred. It required something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. It required one population having slightly more resilience, slightly wider social networks, and slightly more reproductive flexibility during a period when the margin for error had nearly disappeared. Small advantages, compounded over thousands of years, are enough to end a species that had already survived ice age after ice age. There is another layer to this story that only recent genetic research has revealed. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred, the resulting offspring were not always fully viable in an evolutionary sense. Researchers studying the modern human genome have found large regions completely empty of Neanderthal DNA, deserts stretching across certain chromosomes. This suggests that many hybrid individuals may have faced fertility problems, particularly among male offspring. In other words, even the moments of connection between these two species may have carried a biological cost that worked against Neanderthal survival specifically. They were not erased, they were absorbed, unevenly, into a population that would eventually outgrow and outlast them. By around 40,000 years ago, the last confirmed Neanderthal populations were clinging to isolated refuges, including sites in what is now Gibraltar. Small groups, cut off from the wider gene pool, facing a changing climate with a shrinking network of allies and resources. There was likely no single final day, no last battle, just fewer births than deaths, generation after generation, until the line quietly ended. Here is where the story stops being about the past. You carry pieces of them. Every time your immune system responds to a pathogen using a gene inherited from Neanderthal ancestors, every time your skin reacts to sunlight in a way shaped by their adaptation to low-light European winters, you are living proof that extinction is rarely absolute. Something can end as a distinct population and still persist, scattered and diluted, inside the survivors. There is a deeper lesson hiding inside this story, one that has nothing to do with fossils. Neanderthals were not unintelligent. They were not incapable. They were a successful species for longer than Homo sapiens has existed in its current form. What ended them was not a single dramatic failure. It was the slow accumulation of small disadvantages during a period of environmental stress, combined with the quiet demographic power of a more connected, more flexible population, arriving at exactly the wrong moment for them to compete. Survival, it turns out, is rarely about being the strongest. It is about being resilient enough, connected enough, and adaptable enough when the environment stops cooperating. You are not the only human species that ever walked this planet, but in a strange and literal sense, you are also not entirely separate from the one that came before you. Their genes are still making decisions inside your body right now, in ways you will never consciously notice. The line did not end. It just stopped being visible.